Hello, everyone. Welcome. Hi, I'm Oliver.
Hi, I'm Lily.
Science in Easy English. Are you more bacteria than human?
It's such a fascinating question because for decades, the media has basically told us that the answer is this overwhelming yes.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Like imagine carrying around this microscopic city inside you, a city that's so heavily populated and so complex that its citizens can literally hack your immune system.
Yeah, or alter your DNA expression overnight.
Exactly. And dictate everything from your heart health to your mood. So that is the reality of the hidden organ we are exploring in today's deep dive, which is, of course, your microbiome.
And we have so much incredible material to go through today.
We really do. We've been looking at a mountain of recent data, like stuff from 2025 medical journals, these massive 2026 global mapping projects, just groundbreaking research.
Right. And our mission today is to tear down some of these massive, long-held myths about this ecosystem.
Yeah.
We're going to uncover how bacteria use this covert language to talk to your body and, figure out what a healthy gut actually looks like.
Which is so needed because the landscape of microbiome science has completely transformed in just the last few years.
Oh, completely. For the longest time, public understanding has been really clouded by marketing hype.
Yeah, and outdated biology. So today, we are clearing all of that away. We're looking at the hard science of what is actually happening inside your digestive tract. And I think the best place to start dismantling that hype is by correcting the math.
Oh, the math. Yes.
Going back to that question, are you more bacteria than human? The statistic that everyone always repeats, I mean, you see it everywhere, is that bacteria outnumber human cells 10 to 1.
Right. The infamous 10-to-1 ratio. It's probably one of the most pervasive biological factoids out there, and it is completely false.
It's totally made up. I was shocked by this.
Yeah, it didn't come from rigorous sequencing at all. It actually originated from a single back-of-the-envelope calculation that some guy made way back in the 1970s.
Just scribbled on a notepad, basically.
Pretty much. The claim was that you have roughly 100 trillion bacterial cells in your body, just totally dwarfing your human cells, and that this massive bacterial load weighed up to 2 kilograms.
2 kilos. I mean, when I read that, I pictured carrying around like a 5-pound bag of flour in my stomach made entirely of living bugs.
It sounds so heavy when you put it like that.
It does, and I was trying to figure out how scientists let that assumption stand for almost half a century. But looking at the sources, it all comes down to this massive extrapolation error. It's like estimating a city's population by counting the people crammed into one rush hour subway car.
That's a great analogy.
Right. And then you just multiply that packed subway car by the square footage of the whole city. They basically looked at the density of bacteria in 1 gram of feces and just assumed the entire gastrointestinal tract was that densely packed.
Which is just biologically untrue. I mean, the colon is incredibly dense with microbes. It's absolutely packed in there. But the rest of the digestive tract, like the stomach and the small intestine, it's relatively sparse by comparison.
So what are the actual numbers then?
Well, when researchers recently sat down to rigorously calculate the updated reality, accounting for different organ volumes and actual cell densities, the numbers shifted dramatically. You actually have about 38 trillion bacterial cells compared to about 30 trillion human cells.
Wow.
So the ratio is really closer to 1.3 to 1.
Which is basically a 1-to-1 ratio. I mean, it's an equal partnership.
An equal partnership, and a much lighter one, too. The total bacterial mass in your body is only about 200 grams.
So less than half a kilo.
Exactly. You aren't carrying around this heavy sack of microbes. You're carrying around roughly the weight of a large apple.
That is so much more manageable to think about. And what really struck me in the clinical data is that this 1-to-1 ratio isn't even a permanent fixture. Like every time you use the restroom, you are expelling trillions of microbes, temporarily shifting that math.
It's a very dynamic system.
Yeah, and it gets even more extreme with illness. In patients with certain inflammatory conditions, like Crohn's disease, the body sometimes flushes the gut so aggressively that the total bacterial load just plummets. The ratio can actually fall below 1-to-1.
So in those moments, you literally become more human than bacteria.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It's wild. The ecosystem is incredibly fluid.
it really is. And, before we move past the historical context, we should probably correct one more stubborn origin myth.
Oh, about who coined the term.
Yeah. If you do a quick search on who coined the term microbiome, almost every textbook or article tells you it was the Nobel laureate Joshua Lederberg in the early 2000s.
Right, I saw that everywhere too. It creates this illusion that thinking of the body as an ecosystem is this brand new 21st century concept.
But it's not. The historical sources trace the core concepts of microbiome science, and even the specific term microbiome itself, all the way back to the 19th century.
Wow.
Scientists were observing and debating these microbial communities 100 years before Lederberg ever wrote his papers.
That's amazing. Okay, so we fixed the foundational math. You're roughly a 1-to-1 mix of human and microbe, weighing about 200 grams. But moving from how many bacteria there are to who they are, that's where the commercial narrative really clashes with the scientific reality.
Absolutely.
Because if you look at any advertisement for, like, a probiotic supplement, you are constantly being sold the idea of good bacteria to fight the bad bacteria. It's framed as this microscopic battle of heroes and villains.
Which the scientific data firmly rejects. That binary of good versus bad is completely false. Microbes do not wear white hats or black hats. Their behavior is highly context dependent.
Meaning they change based on their environment.
Exactly. A single species of bacteria changes its entire function based on the specific neighborhood it lives in, the food you supply it with, and the health of your own surrounding host tissues.
You know, when I was reviewing the research, the species that perfectly highlighted this dual nature was Akkermansia mucinifera.
Oh, yes. The superstar.
Right. In the commercial probiotic world, it is marketed as a total superstar. It's praised for all these metabolic benefits, like helping host bodies regulate insulin and protecting against obesity. But the literature shows that under certain conditions, when the gut ecosystem is disrupted, that exact same species can promote aggressive inflammation,
It can even exacerbate conditions like colorectal cancer.
which is terrifying.
Yeah.
It completely ruins the good guy narrative.
It really does. It's all about context. To use an analogy, think about a hammer. Is a hammer a good tool or a bad tool?
Right. Well, in a carpentry shop, it's great. It's super productive.
Exactly. But if you bring that same hammer into a sterile surgical suite, it's terrifying and destructive.
That is the perfect way to put it.
And with Akkermansia mucinifera, it feeds on the mucus layer of your gut. In a healthy gut with a thick mucus layer, that feeding actually stimulates the body to produce more mucus, which keeps the barrier strong.
But if the mucus layer is already compromised,
Then its feeding habit suddenly degrades your only defense line, and that drives inflammation.
wow. So calling it universally good is just scientifically illiterate. And that context dependency completely unravels another massive health myth I keep seeing, which is this idea that high diversity in your gut is always the ultimate goal.
Yes, people throw around the phrase increase your diversity as a universal guarantee of health.
But the data shows diversity isn't just a marker of a healthy diet. It reflects this massive web of environmental factors, like extensive social networks correlate with having higher gut diversity, while high stress lowers it.
Right, because if you're sharing physical environments, touching the same surfaces, interacting with lots of people, you're introducing new microbes, that naturally drives up diversity.
But that doesn't inherently mean you're healthier.
Not at all. Which brings us to perhaps the biggest biological myth in obesity research. The firmicutes to bacteroides ratio.
Ah, the famous FB ratio. Let me guess. Another back-of-the-envelope assumption.
You guessed it.
Because firmicutes and bacteroidetes are massive biological phyla. I mean, judging your health by comparing them feels like trying to judge the health of a whole forest by comparing the total number of insects to the total number of animals with backbones.
That is a highly accurate comparison. For years, the FB ratio was touted as the definitive biomarker for obesity risk. The idea was simple. If you had more firmicutes and fewer bacteroidetes, you were destined to be obese.
But where did they even get that idea?
It was primarily based on early rodent studies and severely underpowered human trials.
Right, and Human metabolism is vastly more complex than a laboratory mouse's metabolism. When researchers finally sequenced the FD ratio in a large, healthy Western population, the results were incredibly chaotic.
Completely all over the place.
Yeah. The ratio in perfectly healthy humans wildly ranges anywhere from 1.3 all the way up to 10.3.
It's essentially arbitrary. Relying on that single ratio to predict your metabolic future is just statistically useless.
So it really forces us to abandon these simple ratios and binary labels entirely. If these trillions of microbes aren't just good or bad, and we can't measure them with a simple scale, we have to look at what they're actually doing on a cellular level.
And what they are doing is actively communicating with your immune system in a highly sophisticated language.
And this is where the biology feels more like science fiction to me. To understand this communication, we have to look at the groundbreaking, award-winning research of Dr. Dennis Kasper at Harvard.
Yes, his work is phenomenal.
He spent decades studying a specific resident gut microbe called Bacteroides fragilis. And the first thing that stands out about B. fragilis is its wardrobe.
Its wardrobe, I love that.
It's true. Most bacteria have a static capsule, right, like a rigid protective outer shell. But B. fragilis has a variable capsule. It could manufacture and wear 8 completely different sugar coats.
It constantly swaps out these different sugar capsules to alter its appearance. Basically, it's effectively evading traditional immune detection. By changing its coat, it stays completely under the radar of our defensive cells.
But this evasion isn't malicious, right?
No, not at all. It isn't hiding to launch an attack. It is actively trying to deliver a message to the host.
And the mechanism for how it delivers that message is just astounding. It produces a very specific molecule called PSA, or polysaccharide A.
Right.
The bacteria release this PSA,
Yeah.
and it is picked up by your dendritic cells. Now, dendritic cells are fascinating. They act as the immune system's border patrol.
They literally reach these long, tree-like arms through the epithelial lining of your gut.
Yeah, reaching right through the gut wall to continuously sample whatever molecules are floating by in the intestinal tract. It's incredible.
And under normal circumstances, when a dendritic cell grabs a foreign bacterial molecule, it sounds a massive alarm. It triggers this huge inflammatory cascade to destroy the invader.
But when the dendritic cell takes in the PSA molecule from B. fragilis,
It does the exact opposite.
it basically receives a microscopic ceasefire order.
Exactly. The PSA prompts the dendritic cells to stimulate a completely different type of immune cell called regulatory T cells.
And those act as the peacekeepers.
Yes. They start producing a molecule called interleukin-10, which acts as a powerful systemic anti-inflammatory.
So this specific molecular interaction completely redefines our foundational understanding of immunology. I mean, for generations we were taught the immune system is a purely defensive wall, designed strictly to attack foreign organisms.
But this research proves it's actually in a constant, active negotiation. A resident microbe is actively hacking your immune system, but not to cause disease. It's hacking it to teach your body not to overreact and destroy its own tissues.
It's like a resident spy that actually works for the host government to keep the peace.
That's a great way to think of it. And this training program starts incredibly early, too. Dr. Kasper's lab found that in the early weeks and months of an infant's life, this exact same bacteria, B. fragilis, produces a unique lipid called GSL-BF777.
Okay, what does that lipid do?
It serves a crucial developmental purpose. It physically limits the proliferation of natural killer T cells, or NKT cells, inside the infant's developing gut.
And NKT cells are potent immune agents, right?
Very potent. If an infant produces too many of them, they can trick the developing immune system into a state of chronic excessive inflammation.
Oh, wow. So by producing this lipid to cap the number of NKT cells, the bacteria are essentially acting as pediatricians.
Basically.
They are physically shaping the architecture of the infant's immune system to prevent the development of severe autoimmune conditions, like ulcerative colitis, much later in life.
The implications are profound. Your immune system's baseline tolerance is fundamentally programmed by the bacteria you acquire early in life.
Which naturally leads us to the next critical question, right? If these bacteria are acting as the control board for our immune system, how do we send messages back to them?
How do we shape their behavior?
Exactly. And the primary way we communicate with them is through our diet. And that communication happens far faster than most people realize. We really need to clear up this pervasive myth that your microbiome is locked in, entirely static, and just completely inherited from your mother at birth.
Right. Now, the method of your birth absolutely sets the initial starting lineup. The data shows that vaginal births predominantly transfer lactobacillus species to the infant, whereas infants born via C-section tend to acquire skin-associated taxa like staphylococcus.
And that early acquisition is vital for the initial immune training we just talked about.
It is. But the ecosystem is not frozen in time. The adult microbiome is highly dynamic. Research demonstrates that a major dietary switch, say, moving from a highly diverse plant-based diet to a purely animal-based diet, or vice versa, can completely alter the functional genetic expression of your microbiome in just one single day.
Wait, one day, a 24-hour turnaround is staggering. I always thought our gut bacteria were locked in from childhood.
Mhm.
You're telling me what I eat for lunch today is literally shifting the genetic expression of my gut by tomorrow.
By tomorrow, yes.
That is wild, and the most vital raw material we can feed them to get a good response is fiber, right?
Absolutely, because when you consume dietary fiber, you are specifically feeding resident bacteria like Faecalibacterium prausnitzii.
Okay, Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, quite a mouthful.
It is. But feeding F. prausnitzii is essential for maintaining the physical integrity of your body. Because human bodies cannot digest most fiber on their own. We rely entirely on bacteria like F. prausnitzii to ferment that fiber for us.
And as a byproduct of that fermentation process, the bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids, the most important one being butyrate.
Yes, butyrate. It acts as the master regulator of the colon. It provides the primary energy source for your intestinal cells, and it directly reduces localized inflammation.
And crucially, it actively repairs the intestinal barrier. We always hear about leaky gut syndrome, right? Where the tight junctions in the intestinal wall break down, and that allows harmful pathogens and toxins to leak directly into the bloodstream.
Which triggers chronic systemic inflammation?
Right. Well, butyrate is the molecule that patches those cellular leaks. So when you eat fiber, you are essentially providing the raw architectural materials that your bacteria use to manufacture the spackle that seals your gut lining tight.
And the speed at which that patching happens is entirely dependent on what you ate that day.
Which is incredibly empowering. But diet isn't the only factor dictating this ecosystem, is it?
No, we also have to look at the underlying biological hardware, which is your human genetics. And we can't just limit the conversation to bacteria either.
Oh, right. The deep dive sources introduce a whole parallel universe inside us called the microbiome.
The microbiome, the vast community of fungi living in your gut. Fungi are a critical but often overlooked component of our internal ecosystem, and recent studies from Penn State University have mapped a direct line between human genetics and fungal populations.
Yeah, they identified 148 specific human genetic variants that directly influence which types of gut fungi can thrive inside you.
This means your inherited human DNA is actively pruning and shaping your internal fungal garden.
Which is mind-blowing. For example, the researchers linked specific genetic variants to the overgrowth of a type of yeast called Kazakhstania, and high levels of that specific yeast are heavily tied to an increased risk of cardiovascular disease.
So your genetic code shapes your fungi, and your fungi shape your heart health.
It creates an incredibly intricate web. We have a highly dynamic ecosystem of bacteria and fungi, shifting daily based on what we eat, regulated heavily by our unique genetics, and actively hacking our immune systems to establish peace.
It's so complex, and with an ecosystem this personalized, the ultimate medical challenge is figuring out how to turn this knowledge into reliable, global treatment.
Right, because to treat a dysfunctional microbiome, science first needs to understand what a universally healthy microbiome actually looks like. And historically, microbiome data has been severely Eurocentric, focusing primarily on Western populations.
To fix that, researchers launched the Million Microbiome of Humans Project, or the MMHP. It's this massive global effort aiming to sequence 1 million distinct microbiomes across diverse populations.
To finally establish a true global baseline for human health. And the scale of that project is already yielding massive dividends. In February 2026, researchers published a landmark study analyzing the sequences of over 11,000 individuals across 39 different countries.
And out of that massive data pool, they discovered something incredible. A mysterious group of bacteria known simply as CAG170.
CAG170 is fascinating because it acts like the biological dark matter of the gut. It showed up consistently in the sequencing data of healthy individuals across the globe, regardless of their diet or geography.
But it was noticeably missing or severely depleted in people suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome, clinical obesity, and inflammatory bowel disease.
So what makes CAG170 so elusive? Why does it represent the frontier of this science?
Well, it's because it's part of the uncultured microbiome. Despite knowing its exact genetic fingerprint, scientists currently cannot grow CAG170 in a laboratory petri dish.
Which speaks perfectly to everything we've discussed about context. It won't grow in a lab because a plastic dish isn't a human gut.
Exactly. It likely relies on obligate symbiosis. It needs the specific mucus layer, the specific neighboring bacteria, and the specific temperature of the human body to survive.
It proves how deeply integrated these microbes are with our biology. But until science figures out how to put dark matter like CAG170 into a pill, how are doctors treating severe gut dysbiosis today?
Well, the most dramatic therapy right now is FMT, or fecal microbiota transplantation.
Right.
FMT is arguably the most powerful mechanical intervention we have. It has proven to be an absolute miracle treatment for patients suffering from recurring Clostridioides difficile, or C. diff infections.
C. diff is an incredibly aggressive pathogen, right? Often antibiotic resistant, and it just completely overtakes the gut.
It does. With FMT, doctors literally transplant a carefully screened, healthy microbial ecosystem from a donor into the patient to physically outcompete and destroy the pathogen. It has incredibly high cure rates for a disease that is otherwise deadly.
But the clinical literature we reviewed is very deliberate in warning against the commercial hype surrounding FMT. Because of its massive success with C. diff, people are starting to treat FMT as this magical cure-all. They assume they can use it to treat everything from autism to seasonal allergies.
Which has led to the terrifying rise of DIY at-home FMT kits.
Yeah, that sounds like a nightmare.
The DIY approach is profoundly dangerous. A panacea approach fails precisely because of the complexity we've uncovered today. When people use unvetted feces without rigorous clinical screening, they risk transmitting severe infectious diseases.
And furthermore, because we now know the microbiome interacts heavily with your unique human genetics and your specific immune tolerance, transplanting an incompatible ecosystem can be disastrous.
It can accidentally trigger entirely new, severe conditions in the recipient, such as irritable bowel syndrome or inflammatory bowel disease. You cannot just hotwire a biological ecosystem.
You really can't. The true future of microbiome therapy isn't about generic, broad-spectrum transplants. The medical field is pivoting toward precision medicine. They are developing next-generation probiotics live, engineered biotherapeutics that are carefully custom-tailored to address an individual's unique microbial deficiencies and specific genetic profile.
It requires immense precision. But understanding the mechanics of this ecosystem fundamentally reframes how you look at your own biology. You are not a single, isolated organism navigating the world. You are a highly complex, walking ecosystem operating in constant partnership with trillions of microscopic allies.
That is a brilliant way to synthesize this deep dive. I mean, we started by dismantling the back-of-the-envelope math from the 1970s, establishing that you are a one-to-one partnership of human and microbial cells.
We abandon the childish binary of good versus bad bacteria, realizing their behavior is entirely dictated by the environment.
We uncovered the brilliant undercover immunology of B. fragilis, changing its sugar coats to teach your body peace. We explore the rapid, 24-hour power of dietary fiber and track the global hunt for uncultured phantoms like CAG170 to unlock the therapies of tomorrow.
It is a profound shift in perspective. But, the boundary of this ecosystem doesn't actually stop at the lining of your gut.
And that is exactly the final mind-expanding concept we want to leave you with from the deep dive sources. It's a scientific concept known as the soil-plant-human gut axis.
Right. The research is increasingly showing that your internal microbiome is not an isolated biological bubble. It is heavily influenced and seeded by the microbial health of the literal soil in which your food grows.
In fact, historical human practices like geophagy, which is the deliberate eating of soil, have deep evolutionary links to building human immune resilience and acquiring essential environmental microbes.
It draws a direct, unbroken line from the microscopic health of our internal organs to the macroscopic health of the planet.
Which leaves you with a really fascinating question to mull over. What if the ultimate key to fixing human health and curing our modern epidemics of gut dysbiosis isn't just about engineering a targeted precision pill for the human body? What if the real lasting solution requires us to radically adopt microbiome-friendly agriculture so we can heal the Earth's soil first?
It's a profound biological connection to think about the next time you sit down to eat.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, stay curious, and take good care of those 38 trillion invisible friends you are carrying around. Goodbye.